At 70, Whoopi Goldberg stands as one of Hollywood's most recognizable icons. But behind the laughter and decades of success lies a story few truly know. Her journey, marked by triumphs on stage and screen, is also filled with painful moments, private heartbreaks, and struggles that even fame and fortune could not erase. Now, as the world looks back on her extraordinary career, the truth about her tragedy is finally surfacing. And it's more heartbreaking than anyone ever imagined. Whoopi Goldberg's story begins far from the bright lights of Hollywood. She was born Karen Elaine Johnson in 1955 in the Chelsea Elliott housing projects of New York. The hallways of those buildings smelled of damp concrete, and the walls carried the sound of neighbors' arguments through paper-thin plaster. Her father left when she was still too young to remember him, and her mother, Emma, carried the full weight of raising Whoopi and her brother, Clyde. Emma worked as both a nurse and a teacher, grinding through long shifts until exhaustion pressed down on her like another skin. Their home was filled not with abundance, but with resilience, and from the very start, Whoopi's survival depended on strength she didn't yet know she had. School didn't bring relief. Teachers saw a little girl who couldn't keep up, and they branded her slow, lazy, even stupid. No one realized she had dyslexia. Every red mark on a test felt like a scar on her spirit, and every laugh from classmates became another wound. At 14, she faced the trauma of a teenage pregnancy, followed by a desperate and dangerous attempt to handle it on her own. At 16, the weight of shame and struggle pushed her out of school. With no diploma, no roadmap, and no clear future, she drifted toward a haze of drugs, searching for escape from a life that felt impossible. But Whoopi's survival instinct never died. She clawed her way out of addiction and poverty, taking whatever job she could find. She waited tables, laid bricks, worked in a funeral home. Every shift was a battle, but each also shaped her toughness. What truly kept her alive, though, was her love for performance. In small workshops and tiny theaters, she began to channel her pain into characters. She created voices, personas, and stories that held both comedy and tragedy, laughter and tears. It was there, in smoky rooms and modest stages, that her talent began to burn through the weight of her past. By the early 1980s, she was performing a one-woman show that stunned audiences. It was raw, funny, heartbreaking, every piece of her broken past stitched into living art. The show caught the attention of Steven Spielberg, who cast her in The Color Purple in 1985. Her role as Celie was not just acting, it was a reflection of her own survival. That performance earned her an Oscar nomination, and suddenly the girl once mocked as stupid was standing among Hollywood's most celebrated. From there, her rise was unstoppable. She starred in Ghosts, won an Academy Award, and cemented herself as a cultural icon. From the projects to Hollywood, her journey was never smooth or easy. It was carved out of scars, mistakes, and resilience. But that climb proved something extraordinary, that even a girl from a crumbling housing project, branded as hopeless, could rise to the very summit of American culture and leave a mark that would echo for generations. Fame can look like a blessing from the outside, but for Whoopi Goldberg, it was always a double-edged sword. When The Color Purple hit theaters in 1985, her life changed overnight. The same girl who once sat in classrooms being told she was stupid was suddenly on red carpets, her name being whispered alongside Hollywood legends. The reporters clamored for her words, photographers chased her for pictures, and strangers began to see her not as Karen from the New York projects, but as Whoopi, the star. Yet the applause that lifted her also came with a fire that burned. Success wasn't a gentle rise, it was a storm. Her performance in The Color Purple was raw, vulnerable, and unforgettable. Critics hailed her as a new force, and the world took notice. But with that praise came pressure. She wasn't just an actress anymore, she was a symbol, a black woman breaking barriers in an industry still filled with prejudice. Every step she took, every word she said, was under a microscope. People expected her to be flawless, to carry the weight of representation, to never falter. The truth, though, was that Whoopi was still figuring out how to carry herself, let alone the expectations of millions. When Ghost was released in 1990, her career reached another peak. Her role as Oda Mae Brown made audiences roar with laughter and cry in the same breath. That performance won her an Academy Award, only the second time a black woman had ever taken home such a prize. On stage, she held the golden statue and smiled, but later admitted that, after the lights dimmed, she returned to an empty hotel room. The applause was deafening, but the silence that followed was louder. Fame brought recognition, but not the comfort of stability or love. The early 1990s became a whirlwind. She starred in Sister Act in 1992, and suddenly, she wasn't just a Hollywood star, she was a global phenomenon. Children sang her songs, families quoted her lines, and she became a household name. The film grossed hundreds of millions and turned her into one of the highest-paid women in Hollywood. Yet while audiences saw joy and music on screen, off-screen, she was exhausted. The schedules were brutal, the interviews endless, and the demands of stardom left her drained. She joked on camera, but privately confessed that sometimes her smile was just a mask to hide fatigue. By 1994, she shattered another ceiling when she became the first Black woman to host the Academy Awards solo. It was historic, bold, and unforgettable. But it also placed her under even harsher scrutiny. Every joke she told, every gesture she made, was dissected by critics. Some praised her fearlessness, while others called her inappropriate or controversial. Whoopi had always been blunt, always spoken her mind, and that honesty became both her crown and her curse. The same sharp tongue that made her beloved also sparked public battles. Throughout her career, controversies followed her like shadows. She defended friends like Mel Gibson and Roman Polanski when most of Hollywood turned away, framing her defense in ways that drew outrage. She weighed in on cultural debates on The View, where her words were sometimes misunderstood, sometimes taken out of context, but always magnified. Each time, the cycle repeated. Headlines, criticism, online firestorms, and the painful realization that a few seconds of unfiltered honesty could create months of public backlash. Her candid style didn't always sit well with audiences. On The View, she was praised for speaking truths others were too afraid to say, but she was also attacked for being too harsh or insensitive. She admitted later that the constant battles wore her down. "I'm not perfect," she once said, her voice tired but steady. And that was the heart of it. She was a human being, flawed and unpolished, trying to navigate a world that wanted her to be larger than life. Fame also brought battles in her personal life. Her marriages fell apart under the weight of her career. Her highly publicized relationship with actor Ted Danson became a spectacle, especially after a disastrous comedy roast turned into a scandal that plastered their names across headlines. The public devoured every detail, often forgetting that behind the stories were two people dealing with heartbreak. For Whoopi, the glare of fame meant even love couldn't survive the heat. And then came the battles with her own body. Years of pushing herself caught up with her. In the late 2010s, she faced life-threatening illness, her health collapsing in a way that fame couldn't shield her from. Fans saw her vanish from the view for weeks, not realizing she was in a hospital fighting pneumonia, with only a 30% chance of survival. When she returned, thinner and slower, the standing ovation she received wasn't for her acting or her wit, it was for survival itself. Through it all, Whoopi never stopped showing up. Even when the fire of fame burned her, even when the criticism felt unbearable, she kept speaking, kept working, kept living on her own terms. Fame made her a legend, but it also scarred her. And yet, she chose persistence over silence, resilience over collapse. Her story during these years is not just one of applause and awards, but of public battles, personal losses, and the courage to keep standing in the storm. In the end, her fame was never about perfection. It was about endurance, about walking through fire, scarred but unbowed, and reminding the world that behind every legend is a human being who has fought battles most will never see. Grief has a way of cutting deeper than anything fame or scandal can bring. And for Whoopi Goldberg, some of the hardest chapters of her life came not under the Hollywood spotlight, but in the silence of loss and illness. By the time she turned 50, she had already lived through storms of poverty, broken marriages, and endless criticism. But nothing prepared her for the kind of grief that strips you bare, the kind that makes applause sound hollow. In 2010, Whoopi lost her mother Emma, the woman who had been her anchor through every season of her life. Emma was more than a parent, she was a protector, a warrior who had raised Whoopi and her brother Clyde on her own after their father walked out. Emma had worked herself to exhaustion as a nurse and a teacher, doing double shifts just to keep food on the table in their crumbling New York apartment. To Whoopi, her mother wasn't just family, she was survival itself. When the call came that Emma was gone, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. She later described her mother as her everything, and losing her left a silence no stage could ever fill. Whoopi went to work, put on the armor of humor, and kept smiling for cameras, but behind the scenes she was grieving. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the phone number she could no longer dial. Those were the real reminders of what she had lost. For all her success, for all the accolades, there was nothing she could do to bring Emma back. It was grief in its purest form, a reminder that no amount of fame or fortune could protect her from the pain of being just a daughter missing her mom. Then, 5 years later, another devastating blow came. In 2015, her brother Clyde passed away. He wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a public figure. He was simply her brother, the one person who remembered her childhood exactly as it had been, who called her by her real name, Karen, and who knew what it was like to grow up in the projects with nothing. With Clyde's death, it was as if the last piece of her past was gone. She had buried her mother and now her brother too. She was left as the only one who remembered those early days of hunger and laughter in equal measure. Losing Clyde was like losing a part of herself, the only living witness to the child she once was. The grief was unbearable, but as always, Whoopi turned pain into purpose. She spoke openly about her losses, urging others to cherish their families while they still could. She leaned into her role as a mother, grandmother, and eventually great-grandmother, determined to be the anchor for her own family, the way Emma had been for her. But even as she poured love into her children and grandchildren, the ache of absence lingered. Applause could never drown it out. As if grief wasn't enough, Whoopi also faced battles with her own body. For years she had struggled with endometriosis, a condition that caused constant pain and exhaustion. But, like many women, her suffering was dismissed or overlooked. She lived with it quietly, carrying on with her work, until finally she began to speak out. Using her platform to highlight the importance of women's health, her pain became another reason to advocate, another way of making sure other women weren't left alone the way she often felt. But the darkest chapter of her health struggles came in 2018 and 2019. What began as a stubborn cough and fatigue turned into something life-threatening. She was diagnosed with pneumonia that spread into sepsis, a condition that can kill quickly and without mercy. Doctors told her she had only a 30% chance of survival. For a woman who had spent her life defying odds, this was one battle she couldn't charm or outwork her way through. She later admitted that she came frighteningly close to death. Fans noticed her absence on The View. For 6 weeks, her chair sat empty while she lay in a hospital bed, fighting for breath. Tubes drained fluid from her lungs, machines beeped rhythmically around her, and each day was a negotiation between life and death. She described it later with her trademark bluntness: "I almost left here." Those words, simple but heavy, captured the reality that her story nearly ended there. Not with applause, but with silence. When she returned to The View, she walked onto the set thinner, slower, but alive. The audience rose in a standing ovation, not for a joke, not for a performance, but for survival itself. That moment was different from all the others. It wasn't about her being a star. It was about her being human, a woman who had fought death and won. For the first time in a long time, the applause wasn't hollow. It was gratitude, relief, and recognition of just how fragile life really is. Her near-death experience changed her. She began to talk more about gratitude, about how every morning she wakes up feels like a gift. She reminded her audience not to take health or time for granted. Fame, she explained, means nothing when you're lying in a hospital bed. Trophies don't matter when you can't breathe. Survival itself becomes the greatest victory. Even after recovery, her health remained a challenge. Age brought new battles, and she faced them with the same candor she always had. She even laughed at herself at times, joking about being old, but behind the humor was a clear understanding. Life is fragile, and every breath is precious. Grief, illness, survival. These three forces defined a later chapter of Whoopi's life more than any film role or television appearance ever could. They stripped away the glamour and the spotlight, leaving only the raw truth of what it means to be human. She had stood on the biggest stages in the world, but she had also sat alone in hospital rooms and at funerals, grieving and fighting for her life. And through it all, she chose to keep going. Her story in these years is not one of perfection, but of persistence. She lost the people she loved most. She nearly lost her own life, but she rose again. And in her survival, she reminded millions that resilience is not about being untouched by pain. It's about standing back up, scarred but still breathing, still fighting, still living. Legacy is a word often thrown around when people talk about stars. But for Whoopi Goldberg, it means something far more layered than awards or headlines. Fame has followed her for decades. Oscars, Emmys, Grammys, and Tonys all line her history. Yet, when you step back and look at the real story, her legacy stretches far beyond the trophies, far beyond the applause. It is in the ways she survived, the truths she told, and the lives she quietly touched when the cameras were off. Her life began in the projects of New York, a world of poverty and constant struggle. That beginning could have broken her, but instead, it carved a resilience into her that stayed with her forever. She never pretended it didn't shape her. She spoke openly about hunger, about feeling dumb because of dyslexia, about addiction, about all the mistakes she made before the world ever saw her on stage. For millions of people, especially those who grew up feeling invisible or broken, her story became proof that your beginning doesn't have to decide your ending. That alone is a legacy no award can measure. Then there's the way she broke barriers in Hollywood. At a time when Black women were often pushed to the margins, she carved out space in the center. The color purple showed the world her power, and Ghost made her a household name, earning her an Academy Award. She didn't just succeed, she shifted the landscape, proving that talent and truth could overcome stereotypes. She inspired a generation of young Black actors to dream bigger, to believe that there was a place for them on the biggest stages. Every time she stepped onto a set, she carried more than herself. She carried the weight of representation. But her legacy wasn't just in film. It was in her voice, sharp and unapologetic, on shows like The View. She said things others were too scared to say, and while her bluntness often sparked controversy, it also made space for conversations that needed to happen. She was not flawless, and she never claimed to be. That honesty, that refusal to polish herself into something fake, is what kept people listening. In a world that constantly demands perfection, she showed the value of being human, messy, and real. Still, what sets her apart most is how she turned her scars into service. The losses of her mother and brother nearly broke her, but instead of collapsing, she turned grief into fuel. She gave more to causes that mattered: women's health, HIV/AIDS awareness, education, LGBTQ+ rights. She co-founded companies and projects named after her mother and brother, a way of carrying their memory into the future. She used her platform to shine a light on issues too often ignored, making her influence less about herself and more about lifting others. Even her wealth speaks to her unique kind of legacy. While many stars flaunt extravagant lifestyles, Whoopi built comfort, not excess. Her homes in New Jersey and Italy are sanctuaries, not palaces. Her cars are ordinary. She never chased the image of a celebrity untouchable in wealth. Instead, she showed that success can mean living simply, focusing on family and using money as a tool, not an idol. Her net worth may be tens of millions, but her true fortune is in the mornings spent with grandchildren, the laughter of family dinners, and the peace she has carved out after decades of chaos. Her family is perhaps her greatest pride. Raising her daughter alone through poverty was one of her hardest battles, but it became the foundation for something greater. Today, she is not just a mother, but a grandmother and great-grandmother, roles she cherishes more than any award. She jokes about it on air, calling herself an old broad with a big family. But beneath the humor is a love deeper than any trophy could give her. For Whoopi, legacy is not measured in applause. It is measured in generations, in the children and grandchildren who will carry her story forward long after the spotlight fades. What also stands out is her independence. After 3 marriages, she admitted she never really wanted to be married. She chose freedom instead, a decision that shocked some but empowered many. She became a symbol of living life on your own terms, reminding people, especially women, that happiness doesn't have to follow society's script. You don't need a partner to be complete. You can choose yourself, and that choice can be powerful. And then there's her survival. Twice she nearly lost everything. Once to addiction, and later to pneumonia and sepsis that nearly took her life. Her honesty about those battles is part of her legacy too. She never glamorized recovery, never pretended illness made her noble. She told the truth. Survival is messy, it's painful, but it's worth it. By speaking about her struggles, she gave others permission to face their own with courage. Today, at 70, her legacy lives not only in her work, but in her presence. She still appears on The View, still sharp, still funny, still unfiltered. She is preparing for the long-awaited Sister Act 3. She has launched projects like AWSN, a women's sports network, continuing to push for voices that often go unheard. Every step she takes now feels less about fame and more about making space for others. In the end, Whoopi Goldberg's legacy is not perfection. It is persistence. It is resilience. It is proof that scars can become maps for others to follow. She is the girl who grew up hungry, the woman who stumbled through addiction, the mother who raised a child alone, the actress who broke barriers, the activist who stood for justice, and the survivor who nearly lost her life but came back stronger. Her story tells us that greatness is not about never falling. It is about rising again, even when the world watches. And perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. Not the awards, not the fame, not the roles, but the reminder that being human, flawed and enduring, is enough. She has left behind more than films and shows. She has left a mirror, reflecting resilience back to anyone who feels broken. Her legacy is not written in gold statues, but in the millions of people who look at her and think, if she survived, maybe I can too.